Hello, Chant. I'm not gonna lie, chat. I did this one, like, several days ago. And I started going on, like, a pretty wild rant. And I decided I didn't feel too good about letting it all fly out there. So, gonna redo it today. So, hello everyone. It is a relatively cool day. Now, in the Bay, I was born and raised in the Bay Area. The Bay, this would be a fantastic, relatively warmer day. But here in Cincinnati, where it's been like 80 and humid, basically for the last 3 months, 72 and slight breeze, pretty dry, is actually a little cold. So I am walking around in my office cardigan. See, look, ooh. People from the stream will recognize this as a Stitch Fix item that they picked for me. I said this. I'm gonna try to. I do appreciate people listening to the podcast. It's been really fun to do, honestly, and it gives me time to speak my mind without having to be interrupted. And gets me to get a bunch of steps in. So I've been enjoying it. But one critique that I've heard is I kind of yap a little too much, which is weird because it's the Yap When podcast. But I think some people have said they wish I could get to more questions, but the same amount of time, like about 30 minutes. So I'm going to try to answer more questions and keep it to around 30 minutes. I'm going to try, but we'll see how it goes. With that said, I hope everyone's doing good, and I hope everyone has had a good day or a good start to your day if you're listening to this in the morning. First question. Again, if you want to ask questions in the comment section below, or you can also ask me in chat while I'm on stream. And the best place to do it, the best place to ask questions is in the Discord, which there should be a link below somewhere. So, first question, someone asked about my thoughts on expansion and realignment in baseball, in MLB. So, my thought is a lot of people have this like idea that 2 teams are getting added, and those 2 teams that get added, one will be an AL team, one will be an NL team. And then there'll be a realignment, because now that you have 32 teams, you can now divide that into 8 different divisions. And it all fits very nicely, as opposed to the currently 6 divisions. My thought is, I don't think that MLB would want to add just 2 teams. I would assume they would want to add at least 2 teams, and more likely they would want to add 4, maybe even 6 teams. But there are 2 clear issues with expansion if you're trying to add more than 2 teams. One is there even a market to support not just 2 teams, but 4 or maybe even 6 teams. And if there are markets for 4, maybe 6 teams, you also have to think that's not just 4 or 6 major league teams. That's now an additional AAA team times 2, 4, or 6. Double A, high A, low A, complex, and the Dominican Academy. So, if you're adding not just 1 major league team, but you're adding 6 minor league teams, now you're not just talking about 2 additional teams, you're talking about 12 additional teams. If you go to 4 teams, you're talking about 24 additional teams and 24 additional rosters. And 24, it's not just the active 26 man or the active 40 man, but now you're trying to fill 165 plus or minus a handful of players, depending on injuries and whatnot. You have to add all of those players, professional players, to these teams. So you're adding 2 teams, that's over 300 players you're adding. Okay? If you're adding 4 teams, that's over 600 players. So that begs the question, right? If just rationally, say baseball already has the best players available for all the teams, would the next 600 players be as good? Would the next 600 available players, would they be able to make up, would they be as good in terms of quality as the last 600 players all throughout baseball right now? Because, yeah, in idea and in practice, yeah, you want more teams, you want more fans, you want people to be more engaged with baseball. But is there quality there? It's not just the appetite for doing it from like a fan perspective for 1 major league team. Is there enough quality to service the other 6 affiliated teams? So that's where not a lot of discussion is happening. Like, sure, an additional 2 teams, 300 additional players, sure, it probably makes sense. You could probably figure it out. What it looks like, the expansion draft, all of it. How long does it take to build a team to be competitive? Particularly in the current state of technology and the market, and who knows what the CBA is going to offer in terms of salary and such. So I don't know. I have no clue. But I do know that the fan discussion of expansion and realignment is fun in terms of like actual business and operation. I don't necessarily know if we've had enough discussion to even prepare ourselves for, like, all right, if we had 2 teams, 300 players, over that, 4 teams, 600 players, 6 teams, you're adding almost 1,000 players, 1,000 additional professional players, 1,000 additional professional baseball jobs. Like, that's a lot. That's a lot of players. So I do worry that fans are very much fans, but even the smartest fans, I don't know if they're thinking about it from that perspective. And so I asked that question back to y'all. Like, if there is realignment, if there is and appetite for major league teams, what does that, like, do you believe that there is enough quality player to fill out the rest of an organization as well? And yeah, the easy cop-out answer is yes, but if you had to build an organization of all just undrafted free agents, all current free agents, all designated for assignment, outright waiver claimed players, do you think you could field a competitive team, a winning org? And given how baseball teams currently operate, I don't know how possible that is, honestly. The best players are playing already, at least at the major league level. It's hard to think that there's, meat left on the bone out there on the open market still, And if there is, it's probably very expensive. There are probably contracts that are very difficult to acquire, So, anyway, it's a good question, though. Personally, another thought that I had was when people do realignment and stuff, a lot of people, shout out to John Edwards who brought this up a couple different places, but not enough people think about it from like a perspective of like travel. A lot of people like thinking, minimize the distance between cities, but you're not necessarily minimizing the distance between cities. You got to minimize the distance of away trip legs. So if you, it's not like, theoretically, if you're closer to all the teams that you are going to play for the most part, you should theoretically have less travel, but that's actually not true. Our trip to the West Coast just now, we went from LA to Arizona back to LA. Like, that's an additional, 1,000 miles, even though if, like you said, we're playing those three teams and you just drew like Euclidean distance lines to each of those cities, you'd say, oh yeah, they're only traveling X amount of miles. Well, you're not including the trips between these cities because we're going from one to another and then back to LA, right? So some people are just not thinking about it from the perspective of like what an actual away trip looks like, particularly for teams going from the West Coast to the East Coast or vice versa. Like Miami going to the West Coast or Seattle going to the East Coast. The people in the league office who put together these schedules, they try to be cognizant that if you're going onto the West Coast, you're going to try to fit in as many West Coast games as possible. It's one of your longest trips if you're an East Coast team, because they don't want you flying out and being at a disadvantage in terms of travel, sleep, time zone, etc. But there's no good way to do it. You can't just make a bunch of smaller trips to the West Coast and assume that's going to be fair given travel time. But you also staying out on the West Coast for like 10 to 14 days is also unfair because not necessarily all teams have to do that, right? Cincinnati Reds actually is a team that has the least amount of travel because of how central we are, which you would think, wouldn't Texas or Chicago, Colorado be more central in the scheme of the airports in the United States? Not when it comes to legs of a trip. So NL Central being very close to each other. Plus, when you do go to the West Coast, we've been very fortunate to have like long trips on the West Coast So we actually end up traveling less than most teams. I think we actually travel the least out of all teams. So when you think about like realignment, just from a traveling perspective, not a lot of people think about it from the perspective of like, how long is an away leg? Like, what would that functionally look like? When you put together a schedule, on average, you're saying you're making trips shorter, but in actuality, are you increasing variance of away trips? In which case, you're not necessarily fixing the problem. Like the player experience at times is worse, even though over the course of the season you traveled less. But like, what does that matter to a player if you traveled, 100-ish miles less, but you spent like you had more 14-day road trips than you ever had, So another way people don't necessarily think about it as in depth. Okay, I swear I'm going to answer more questions. Next one. What are underrated stats? So I get a question of underrated stats, not necessarily frequently, but a good amount. I've answered it a handful of different ways on the pod. But I'll start off this one with the idea of just defensive stats. Because that is always the most underrated stat, in my opinion. I think a lot of people have a difficult time trying to quantify what is good defense, and especially in a game like baseball, where defensive positions, certain positions see more balls in play, and therefore they have to field and defend more balls in play than other positions. For example, a shortstop has to catch, field, throw the ball more often than the third baseman. And that's because the distribution of where a ball gets hit, it gets hit in the path of the shortstop more often than it does for a third baseman. Okay. Makes sense, just in terms of how the distribution of where people hit balls go. However, like when you're evaluating whether or not a shortstop is as good as a third baseman, a lot of people see like, oh, well, this person made this routine play. This other person does it the same way. Why couldn't you just play this third baseman at shortstop? Well, the volume, right? There's a volume of plays. You don't necessarily know what would happen if that third baseman ended up getting more and more reps at shortstop. A good example of this here at the Reds was in 2021. We had a third baseman, Eugenio Suarez, who came up and did play shortstop in his career as a minor leaguer. And we had him play shortstop for a lot of games in 2021. And he wasn't very good at shortstop. So even though he was average at third base, it doesn't make them immediately average at third. So what was the disconnect? What's the difference? That's where I believe, and many believe, that defensive statistics are actually fairly underrated. Like, more underrated than what most people would say. So, to answer it slightly differently, there isn't actually a lot of good public, let me rephrase this. In the public, there isn't data available to make the best defensive metrics. That is all data that the league has, and MLB has a defensive metric that seems very good, or at least better than public metrics with outs above average, but that is only available at an aggregated level. You can't actually see outs above average on each play in, let's say, your StatCast, pitch by pitch, play by play CSV. And so that is difficult, right? Like, if you're unable to evaluate players the same way, then how helpful is it, right? So it's underrated, but it's also, defense is underrated. There are good statistics on defense, but if you're unable to get data equally as you can get like pitch data, you're able to get velocity and break and all this physics info, and you could really dive super deep into the value of what makes a pitch valuable. You can't necessarily do that with defense right now. It makes it hard to say that like defense, the value of defense can be apples to apples with the value of pitching or the value of hitting or swinging. So I tend to think a little like defense not only is underrated, but it's also underdated. So the data available to create defensive metrics is more limited. So it's underrated, and it's also underserved and underserviced. All right, I'm going to turn these questions out now. What if I got to pick a dream city when it's all said and done? Where do I want to live? That's a good question. I love San Diego. I think San Diego weather's perfect. Year round, it's really nice. I grew up in the Bay Area, so that's not too far from the Bay. It's also warmer than the Bay. I love San Diego, but I will say I've fallen in love with San Juan. San Juan, Puerto Rico that's pretty incredible. I love San Juan. If I could go to San Juan every day, if I could wake up and I'm in San Juan, I'd be living a pretty freaking good life. So, I don't know. I've like joked with myself about like trying to make it work where I'm like staying in San Juan for like several weeks in the off season, but there's so many different things I got to travel for, and it's definitely expensive to pay rent in two places. I don't know how possible it'd be just to like dole out thousands of dollars to live in San Juan for several weeks. But one of these days, win the lotto and just go in on like a long-term Airbnb out there every month or every winter. But I'd love to retire in San Diego. Not that I'm thinking about retirement anytime soon. Well, I guess I'm thinking about retirement in terms of streaming, but San Diego or San Juan, either. What sport has the hardest playoffs to get into? So the way this was phrased was, is baseball the hardest sport to get into the playoffs? I'll reference two things. One, Mike Lopez wrote up a really good blog post on when you're in the playoffs, how often does the best team win? And in baseball, it's almost a coin flip. It is relatively the most random North American professional sport that awards a championship. So the best team only wins the World Series a little north of 50% of the time. In contrast, basketball, the best team in basketball in the NBA wins the NBA championship, the NBA finals, I think something like 75% of the time. So far more signal towards whoever the best team was coming in is also the most likely to win. Whereas in baseball, if you get into the playoffs, it's anyone's game, seemingly. Which I know when you're watching baseball, it doesn't seem that way, but statistically, that is what it is. So I would say once you're in the playoffs, it's difficult. I would say the regular season is so many games that it actually does end up awarding who is the best that given year. However, there's one thing to say about sports that are very long, at least ones that have long regular seasons. A lot of the time it's a battle of attrition. The teams that make the playoffs at the end, most of them stayed very healthy relative to all other teams. Teams that end up getting injured more often have key players who are injured for certain stints in the season. That becomes a burden, and it obviously affects your win-loss record. So teams that are more healthy have more players, their best players available more often. They tend to be the best teams as well. And while baseball is very prominent in that, I would say hockey, NHL, might be like the hardest sport from that perspective. Not only are you playing 82 games and you're playing several times every week, but it is a sport that incentivizes violent contact, right? Like, not just like every now and then you get sacked, or every now and then you might get an elbow in the face in the paint, but like if you're on the ice, you're sprinting, and then if you're near the puck, you might be body checked into a wall, and that's going to happen multiple times in the game. So to stay healthy and to have minimal amounts of concussions in NHL seemingly is like the way to make the playoffs. If you're the healthiest team, you tend to make deeper runs in the playoffs. So I would like to think that the hardest sport to make the playoffs and ultimately to win a championship would be the Stanley Cup and in the NHL. Like, that's a brutal sport, and you got knives on your feet. You're literally getting beat up every night, and you're expected to survive from October to May. Like, that's crazy. It's crazy. MMA on ice, you know? Like, it's in baseball, it's like some of the more violent or contact-ridden points of the game are like plays at the plate, plays at the wall. But like the thing that makes it tough in baseball is like you versus yourself. Like the amount of times you have to throw high velocity pitches and how much that wears on your tendons and your muscles and your bones. How often you have to swing and how much that affects your oblique and your back and your legs. Over the course of time, with so many reps at high intensities, or intensities, that's not a word, right? So many reps at high intensity, that's what wears you down. It's how repetitive certain motions are and how relatively unnatural they are for the human body. So, baseball is you versus yourself, and trying to manage that its own issue. But in my mind, like, if I'm getting concussed once a week, that's got to be one of the most difficult sports to go back and be like, all right, I'm ready to be the best player on the ice again. Not just like the day after, but like minutes after maybe a traumatic injury, you know, that you don't know that you have yet. I don't know. All right, one more, and then I think we're done. Playoff hardest, Dream City. Oh, this was a cool question. Someone asked, what is it like being an analyst, or what are the responsibilities of analysts if they're analysts for a baseball team that isn't affiliated with MLB? So say you are an analyst for a team in the KBO or the MPB, so in Korea or in Japan. What if you're an analyst for a Taiwanese team? What if you're an analyst for an indie ball team? And my answer is actually pretty simple. It's not so different than being an analyst for a college team. And I would recommend anyone who's asking this question, if you are still in school, try to set up a meeting with a student manager or a coach at your school and see what it would take to be a student analyst or a student manager. Because a lot of teams are like open doors, come on in, if you could play around with data and help us out, like that would be very helpful, right? And there's a ton of data that collegiate teams, especially like D1 teams, collect, and they're definitely wanting to figure out a way to get to Omaha, so which is where the College World Series is. So absolutely, if you want to know what it's like to be an analyst for a team that isn't affiliated with MLB, you could absolutely do that, and you don't have to go too far for it. Just maybe walk to the baseball field and see if a coach is around to walk you through how you could get on the team as an analyst. And that work is a lot like what the work is for NPB, KBO, Taiwanese League, Australian League, Dominican or Venezuelan or Puerto Rican League. Like, there are a lot of different leagues on top of like American independent ball, like the American League or Pioneer League or the Frontier League. Like, you have a lot of leagues out there that aren't affiliated with MLB, and some of them have analysts. Many of them don't, the professional ones, but a lot of them do. So, but if you want to dabble in that world, if you're in college, I'd say ask a coach. So. All right, chat. Yo, chat. You let me know on stream, in the comments, in the Discord, if answering more questions was better, or if you rather me answer like fewer questions and I yap longer. I think there's pros and cons, right? Fewer questions, I stay on topic, but I stay on topic and I answer more questions, but you don't get that random Nick Wan tangential yap. Fewer questions, obviously fewer answers, but a lot more freedom for me to explore my own mind. I don't even know what people want from this. Honestly, there's like 10 people who watch these things. All right. I'm gonna go home, but hope everyone is good. It's an off day for the Reds today. Hope everyone is enjoying their week. I will catch y'all on the next one. Bye, y'all.